Hollywood is full of compromises. But what happens when the compromise is so extreme, the artists behind the film no longer recognize what they created? For every visionary director or dedicated actor, there's a finished product that doesn't resemble what was envisioned on set. It might look like a completed film on the surface, edited, scored, and released to the public. But to those who made it, it's a ghost, an imposter, a version they never wanted the world to see. Sometimes it's studio interference. Sometimes it's ego wars, test screenings gone wrong, or producers with a very different agenda. In rare cases, the fallout becomes public. Directors denounce the release, actors walk out of premieres, writers claim their scripts were butchered beyond recognition. In other cases, the silence is contractual, sealed behind NDAs and unspoken threats of legal action. But even in that silence, clues remain. Discreet comments in interviews, passive-aggressive quotes in memoirs, a name quietly removed from the credits, or a film that everyone involved simply stops talking about. These aren't cases of bad reviews or box office flops. There's something more disturbing. Works that the cast or crew openly rejected, disowned, or even apologized for. Today, we're revisiting 15 films whose creators turned their backs on what eventually reached audiences. Some were mutilated by studio scissors, some were reshaped by marketing departments, and some were simply taken from their makers and twisted into something unrecognizable. But in each case, one truth remains. Those who made these films wish they hadn't. What happens when the people who made a film wish it never existed? David Lynch's Dune, 1984. It's a failure. I didn't have final cut. That's the truth. David Lynch. David Lynch is one of the most distinctive voices in cinema. But Dune, 1984, remains his most painful regret. Lynch was lured into the adaptation by the promise of creative freedom, but as the production ballooned more effects, more characters, more interference, he lost control. When the final cut was assembled, it wasn't his. Entire subplots vanished, voiceovers were added, scenes were shuffled. Lynch refused to call it his film. For decades, he declined interviews about it. He turned down offers to release a director's cut. His silence was its own statement. Unlike other filmmakers who fight for their vision, Lynch simply walked away. And yet, within the flawed chaos lies a strange beauty, a glimpse of what could have been if only Lynch had been allowed to be Lynch. What does it mean when even a genius walks away from his creation and never looks back? Highlander 2, The Quickening, 1991. It's beyond embarrassing. I disown it entirely. Christopher Lambert. Highlander 2 is often cited as one of the worst sequels ever made. But its failure wasn't just creative, it was contractual, financial, and nearly surreal. Shot in Argentina under severe economic turmoil, the production lost creative control to Bond companies. Director Russell Mulcahy walked out after seeing the first cut. Christopher Lambert stayed only under threat of litigation. Sean Connery, lured by a paycheck, later joked that he never understood the plot. The script, rewritten by financiers, introduced aliens, rewrote immortality rules, and ignored the original film's entire mythology. The final product was so incoherent that it felt like a parody of itself. Years later, a renegade version tried to restore some coherence, but the damage was irreversible. Everyone involved, from cast to crew, wished they could erase it from history. Can a sequel be so misguided it renders the original meaningless? Blade, Trinity, 2004. I only did it because I was contractually obligated. Wesley Snipes. By the time Blade, Trinity went into production, the franchise had already cemented itself as a cult icon. But the third installment wasn't just troubled, it was imploding from within. Wesley Snipes, the face of the franchise, reportedly clashed with director David S. Goyer and the studio. Tensions escalated to the point where Snipes refused to speak to anyone on set, communicating only through post-it notes signed Blade. Some crew members claim he barely opened his eyes during scenes, letting stand-ins handle wide shots. Goyer, simultaneously the writer and director, leaned heavily on new characters played by Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel. Snipes was sidelined in what was supposed to be his own film. The atmosphere was toxic. Lawsuits followed. Years later, both Snipes and Goyer remained cagey about what really happened, but neither defended the film, and the franchise went dark for nearly 2 decades. What happens when the hero of a franchise turns his back on the very film that bears his name? Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, 1995. I was heartbroken. What they released wasn't my story. Daniel Farrens. Intended to revive the Halloween franchise, The Curse of Michael Myers became a case study in post-production interference. Writer Daniel Farrens crafted a mythology-heavy script to deepen the lore, but the studio, worried it was too complex, panicked after test screenings. Massive reshoots were ordered. Gore was added. The tone shifted. The ending was restructured. Donald Pleasance's scenes were heavily edited after his death, and the final cut was stitched together, hastily losing coherence in the process. Farrens distanced himself. Cast members expressed frustration. Even hardcore fans were divided. Years later, the producer's cut was leaked, restoring the original tone and structure. It didn't fix everything, but it revealed just how much had been stripped away. Can a horror film survive when the scariest thing happens in the editing room? The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. It was a cursed production. I tried to survive it. John Frankenheimer. The Island of Dr. Moreau was meant to be a moody, philosophical horror film directed by Richard Stanley. But after just a few days of shooting, Stanley was fired. Enter veteran director John Frankenheimer, who walked into one of the most chaotic productions in modern history. Brando wore ice buckets on his head. Val Kilmer refused direction. Entire scripts were rewritten overnight. Stanley, in an act of quiet rebellion, reportedly returned to set disguised as an extra just to watch the collapse firsthand. Frankenheimer, exhausted and combative, clashed with both cast and crew. When asked if he'd ever work with Kilmer again, he replied, "Not even if I'm directing a home movie." The final product was a mess, a fever dream of ambition and egos clashing mid-flight, and no one involved was proud of it. What if a director inherits a disaster and still ends up blamed for it? Superman 2, 1980. They fired me, then used my footage. It was betrayal. Richard Donner. Richard Donner had directed Superman, the movie, to global acclaim. He was deep into filming Superman 2, having completed nearly 75% when he was abruptly fired. The studio wanted something lighter, funnier. Donner wanted gravitas. The two visions collided, and the studio replaced him with Richard Lester. Lester reshot large portions of the film, added slapstick humor, and altered the tone entirely. But many of Donner's scenes, especially the emotional beats, remained. The result was a hybrid. And for Donner, an insult. For years, fans speculated about what Donner's version might have looked like. In 2006, Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, was finally released. It was darker, more coherent, and emotionally resonant. It was also the version many believed should have been seen all along. Donner never forgave the betrayal. And though he returned to praise in later years, this wound never fully healed. Can a film be yours if someone else decides how the world sees it? RoboCop 21990. It was a Frankenstein script, a stitched corpse of what we intended. Frank Miller. Fresh off the cult success of The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller was lured to Hollywood to write RoboCop 2. His ideas were bold, bizarre, and deeply satirical, perfect for the world of omni-consumer products. But Hollywood wasn't ready. Miller's script was ripped apart by the studio. His dark political commentary, surreal plotlines, and edgy violence were deemed unfilmable. Writers and producers rewrote it endlessly. The resulting film was a chaotic blend of tone-deaf action and half-baked philosophy. Miller was horrified. He distanced himself from the movie. Years later, his original screenplay was adapted into a comic series revealing a far more radical, daring vision. Director Irvin Kershner did what he could, but the machinery of studio filmmaking swallowed both intent and personality. What happens when a storyteller learns the system doesn't want stories, just product? All the Pretty Horses, 2000, they destroyed my film. They destroyed my career. Billy Bob Thornton. Billy Bob Thornton had a vision. An epic, lyrical adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's melancholic novel, All the Pretty Horses. What he delivered was a 3-hour poetic meditation on love, loss, and the cruelty of borders. What audiences saw was a 1-hour, 5-6-minute studio cut with a new score and missing soul. Miramax, led by Harvey Weinstein, found the original cut too slow and unmarketable. They demanded drastic edits, removed Daniel Lanois's haunting score, and slapped on a conventional soundtrack. Thornton was devastated. So were the actors. Matt Damon and Penelope Cruz reportedly mourned the final version. Thornton refused to promote the film. Critics called it incoherent. It vanished quickly from theaters. His trajectory as a serious director crippled overnight. Years later, the original cut still hasn't been released. It exists in vaults, unseen, and possibly forever buried. If a masterpiece is mutilated before birth, did it ever live? Scream 3, 2000. I was heartbroken. I wrote something real. They turned it into noise. Aaron Kruger, ghostwriter commentary. Scream 3 was meant to close the trilogy with a bang. Instead, it limped to the finish line, confused, overproduced, and strangely toothless. But behind the scenes was a far more complex story of grief, censorship, and a studio paralyzed by real-world fear. Original screenwriter Kevin Williamson, the mind behind the franchise, had left. A new writer, Aaron Kruger, was brought in amid tight deadlines and executive interference. The Columbine shooting had just happened, and studios were terrified of media backlash. As a result, the original script filled with satire and sharp violence was gutted. Themes of trauma, Hollywood exploitation, and meta-commentary on abuse were softened or outright cut. Director Wes Craven, who had once fought for creative boldness, was boxed in by restrictions. Kruger later admitted he barely had time to finish the script before filming began. He was told what not to write, more than what to write. The result? A film that lost the bite and purpose that defined the first two entries. If horror becomes afraid of fear itself, what's left? Exorcist, The Beginning, 2004. I was replaced, then they used my footage, and I still don't know why. Paul Schrader, The Making of Exorcist. The Beginning is a tale of two films and one disillusioned director. Paul Schrader, known for intense psychological stories, Taxi Driver, Affliction, was hired to explore the dark theology behind Father Merrin's origins. He delivered a slow, cerebral horror film. The studio didn't like it. Not enough jump scares, not marketable. So they shelved Schrader's version and brought in Rennie Harlin to reshoot the entire film with more blood, action, and standard horror beats. Harlan's version bombed. Critics panned it. Audiences were confused. In a bizarre twist, the studio allowed Schrader to release his original cut Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, a year later. It too received mixed reviews, but many praised its ambition and restraint. Two films, same story, same cast, different tone. Schrader's version was the one he stood by, but it was never truly his to control. If two directors tell the same story, which one gets to call it theirs? The Snowman, 2017. We didn't shoot 10–15% of the script. It was like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. Tomas Alfredson, adapted from Joe Nesbo's best-selling crime novel, The Snowman had everything. A chilling Nordic setting, a strong cast led by Michael Fassbender, and a proven source material. But the final film felt incomplete. Because it was. Director Tomas Alfredson later admitted that production was rushed. Locations weren't secured. Time ran out. Key scenes from the script were never filmed. As a result, the editing room became a battlefield of patchwork solutions, ADR lines, spliced footage, and narrative gaps so large they swallowed the plot. Critics were baffled. Viewers were lost. Even the marketing seemed to apologize for the film. Alfredson, visibly exhausted, told the press he simply didn't have enough material to make the story coherent. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't ego. It was something more tragic. A film that could have worked if only they had finished making it. Can you judge a film if you've only seen 85% of it? Alien 3, 1992. To this day, I can't watch it. It breaks my heart. David Fincher. Before 7. Before Fight Club. David Fincher's directorial debut was a studio nightmare. Alien 3 wasn't just his first feature, it was a cautionary tale of what happens when an auteur is thrown into a machine already in motion. Fincher inherited chaos. No finalized script, constant rewrites. Fox executives hovered over every decision. He shot scenes he didn't believe in, was denied final cut, and watched as post-production twisted his vision into a hollow, inconsistent product. When the film hit theaters, Fincher disowned it completely. The studio's version was critically panned. Fans were outraged over beloved characters being killed off in the first act. Years later, an assembly cut emerged closer to Fincher's intent, but still not endorsed by him. Despite this brutal beginning, Fincher became one of the most respected directors of his generation, but he never forgot Alien 3. He once described the experience as a prison sentence, one that taught him never to make a movie without control again. What if a filmmaker's worst film is the one they weren't allowed to make? The Butterfly Effect, 2004. It was heartbreaking. That's not the movie we shot. Amy Smart. The Butterfly Effect wasn't just a dark psychological thriller, it was a film with 4 different endings, but only one made it to theaters. And it wasn't the one most of the cast or even the directors preferred. Co-directors Eric Bress and J. Mackie Gruber originally envisioned a deeply tragic story about fate and sacrifice. The preferred ending, where Evan travels back to his birth and prevents his own existence, was tested and approved by many on set. Amy Smart, who played Kaylee, said that version made her cry every time, but the studio feared the ending was too bleak, too alienating. Instead, they chose a tamer, more ambiguous finale. It tested better with audiences but gutted the emotional impact. The result was a film that felt off-tone. Cast and crew rarely spoke about it afterward, and the alternate endings, hidden on DVD releases, tell a very different story than the one millions saw in theaters. If the most powerful ending is the one we're not allowed to see, did the film ever truly exist? Fantastic Four, 2015. A year ago, I had a fantastic version, and it would have received great reviews. Josh Trank deleted tweet. Before its release, Fantastic Four was meant to reboot the franchise with grit, realism, and indie sensibility. Josh Trank, coming off the surprise success of Chronicle, was promised creative control. But Hollywood doesn't always keep its promises. Behind the scenes, Trank clashed with Fox executives. He envisioned a grounded, body horror take on the superhero origin. The studio wanted action, spectacle, and commercial safety. What followed was a brutal editing war, reshoots, and a final cut that bore little resemblance to Trank's original. On opening day, Trank tweeted a now infamous message, disowning the film, claiming the great version would never be seen. The tweet vanished, but the message stuck. Critics eviscerated the film. Audiences stayed away. Trank's career stalled for years. But buried in the wreckage is a question that haunts many directors. Was the failure his fault, or the price of vision in a corporate system? When the studio reshapes a film beyond recognition, who gets blamed, the director or the system? American History X, 1998. This wasn't my film anymore. Tony Kaye. When American History X premiered in 1998, it was met with critical praise and an Oscar nomination for Edward Norton. But director Tony Kaye wasn't celebrating. In fact, he wanted his name removed from the film. The clash began in the editing room. Kaye delivered a 95-minute cut, but Norton, armed with both clout and conviction, pushed for more character depth, especially for his own role. The studio sided with Norton. The result? A 119-minute version that Kaye felt betrayed his vision. What followed was a meltdown. Kaye requested his name be replaced with Humpty Dumpty. He took out full-page ads in Variety attacking the studio. He even brought a rabbi, a priest, and a monk to a New Line meeting, hoping spiritual pressure would reverse the decision. It didn't. Despite the final film's success, Kaye's career was derailed. He was labeled volatile, unprofessional. But some still ask, was he a madman or a director protecting a vision hijacked by star power? Can a performance be too powerful so much that it hijacks a film from its own director? The Poughkeepsie Tapes, 2007. We made something too real. Maybe that's why no one wanted to claim it. Anonymous crew member? The Poughkeepsie Tapes was never meant for mainstream audiences. Shot in a faux documentary style that blurred the line between fiction and snuff, it told the story of a serial killer who documented every act in disturbing detail. The found footage format made it feel like evidence too convincing, too raw. Premiering at Tribeca in 2007, the film quickly vanished. Its release was pulled without explanation. No official statement, no campaign, just silence. Rumors swirled. Test audiences reportedly walked out. Studio executives feared backlash. Even those who worked on it seemed hesitant to discuss it publicly. Eventually, it was quietly released years later. But the damage or the mystique was done. To this day, it carries a reputation not just as a horror film, but as a cursed object, something that was suppressed not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. What if a film is disowned, not by its makers, but by the system that can't risk letting it be seen? Cinema is often seen as a collective triumph: director, cast, crew, studio, all united behind a vision. But these stories prove that unity is a myth, that behind some of the most infamous titles lie bitter regrets, lost battles, and creative voices silenced before the final cut. Some of these films were sabotaged, others abandoned, but all carry the same shadow, a disconnection between the art and its makers. Which of these films felt the most tragic to you? And more importantly, can we ever trust what we see on screen when even the creators don't? If this list uncovered a truth you hadn't heard before, subscribe and tell us, which film do you think deserves a second chance, and which should have stayed buried?